Hi guys and welcome back. In this video we're going to be completing our HIIT timer that we started last week. If you remember the last video, we left it after coding the HTML and CSS parts of the site. HTML and CSS allow us to define the structure and style of a web page, but they don't really allow us to make it interactive. So now that we want the user to be able to, interact with the site, then we need to add two more things. We need to add some JavaScript into the site, and we're also going to add some Python. The interactions that the user is going to have are to do with the progress bar. They're going to see the progress bar shrink over time while the seconds counter also decreases over time. And they're also going to be able to submit the form, and our application is going to remember what values they entered as they go through the entire set of pages. So let's get to it. Let's have a look at what we've got here in the code, and then we will start writing the new stuff. So you can see that in the last video, we developed 4 different code files. We have home.html, we've got exercise.html, rest.html, and then the styles.css page. Home.html, we used it sort of as a place to develop all of the components and styles that our app was going to use. So you can see that home.html, which I've got open here on the right, has the logo and the header. It's got the setup, welcome message there. It's also got the timer, it's got the progress bar, and then it's got the form that users will interact with. Of course, in the welcome page, we don't really need the timer and the progress bar, so we're going to get rid of that, knowing that we've already copied it into rest and exercise.html. So we've got those things in there. The home.html is only going to be responsible for allowing the user to enter the values for their exercise, rest, and number of sets. But we're not going to start work in this video on the form. We're actually going to go over to rest.html and work on the progress bar. So I'm going to open rest.html here, and then I'm going to go over to my browser, and I'm going to open rest.html here as well. So I'll do rest.html, and you can see that this is what it looks like. I'm just going to zoom in here slightly so you guys can see it a bit better, and there we have it. So as soon as we load rest.html, what should happen is that this should start going down to 14 seconds and then 13 seconds and so on, and this progress bar should start shrinking a little bit at a time as well, so that at the end of 15 seconds, we've essentially reached the bottom of the progress bar or the end of the progress bar, and this should show 0 seconds. The only way to dynamically change the contents of a website after the browser has loaded it is by using JavaScript. So we're going to write a short snippet of JavaScript code that does this. It's going to essentially change these two components or these two HTML elements every second. Let's take a look at how we do that. The first thing to do is to go ahead and, while still inside the body, we're going to add a script tag in HTML. So this is going to be script type equal application/JavaScript. And then inside the script body here, we're going to write our JavaScript code. Normally, you would place JavaScript code in a separate file, something like app.js or something like that, and you would import it into your HTML code, but because this is so short, we're just going to write it in here. This is totally acceptable. What we're going to do is, first of all, we need to gain access inside our HTML code to the timer, the 15-second timer, and the progress bar. So let's do that. We can start off by creating 2 variables, or 2 constants in this case, called timer element and progress bar, and then we're going to get the elements by ID for the timer, which is this one here, and for the progress bar, which is this element here. Once we've got those elements, we can go ahead and make use of them. What we're going to do first is create a variable that I'm going to call timer counter that is going to keep track of the value that we're currently sitting at. So it's going to start off at 15, which is the maximum value of the progress bar, and then every second we're going to shrink this variable by 1, and we're going to use that variable to update the current value of the progress bar as well as the text inside this timer span. So how we do that in JavaScript is we are going to create an interval variable that is going to be equal to setInterval, and inside it we're going to define a function. In JavaScript, we've got 2 ways of defining functions. We can use the traditional function syntax like this, or we can also use the fat arrow syntax, which is essentially the same. There's just a couple of small differences with scope and the value of this and whatnot, but we don't have to worry about those for here. This here is creating a function that we can then execute every second. How we tell set interval that we want to run this every second is by putting a 1000 as a second argument to set interval. So you can see here we've got the function as the first argument and the 1000 as the second argument, and just like in Python, these are separated by commas. Now, this function will run every 1000 milliseconds, so every second. And what we want to do here is, first of all, we want to check whether the timer counter is less than or equal to 1. If it is less than or equal to 1, we want to stop this interval from running again. So we'll do clear interval, interval. And that means that when we reach the end of the timer, we're going to stop running this code every second. Because what this code is going to do is it's going to do timer counter equal timer counter minus 1. It's going to take 1 away from the counter, and then it's going to do timer element dot inner text equal timer counter plus the s string. So it's going to, for example, put 14s in here. And we're also going to do progress bar dot value equal timer counter. So it's going to change the progress bar value from 15, let's say, down to 14. And then the following second down to 13, and so on. Okay, so if we save this and then refresh the rest page, you'll see that it now starts going down 1 second at a time. Okay, now all we have to do is do the same thing, but for exercise.html. So here we've got exercise.html, and all we have to do is go ahead and copy this script here, go to exercise.html, paste it in there inside the body, but below everything else. We have to make sure that we've got our IDs correct, and it seems that they are because they're the same, and everything else is just remaining the same as well. Notice that because we've got the progress bar value here set to 45, but in rest.html is set to 15, the code doesn't have to change at all in terms of the JavaScript code because it's using that starting value anyway. The next thing we want to do is that when we stop this interval here, when we reach the end of the progress bar, in either case, we want to send the user to the other page. So if they're currently on exercise, we want to send them to rest, and if they're currently on rest, we want to send them to exercise. However, doing that when we've got the files directly being served from our computer's file system is not so easy. So what we need to do is to change between pages. In order to change between pages and to serve all the pages in our application from a common address, for example, example.com/exercise or example.com/rest, we need to be able to serve these pages from one place, and that place is a server. The server that we're going to be using here is the Flask development server. So we're going to have to install Flask in our Python project and use it to serve these pages. So let's take a look at how we can do that. First of all, this project here looks a lot like just a HTML, CSS static website, but nothing is stopping us from creating a Python project in here. All we have to do is create a virtual environment that's going to host our Python libraries, and then create some Python files in here, and we can use these files as well. It's not a problem. What I'm going to do is open up a terminal down here. I know this is a bit difficult to see, but all we have to do then is say pymvm.vm, and that's going to create a virtual environment in our project. A virtual environment, if you're not sure what it is just another installation of Python that doesn't have any libraries installed in it. I'm going to leave a link in the description of this video with some more information. What we do then is we do source vm scripts activate. And that is going to activate our virtual environment. And now you can see that every time we press enter, we get this bracket .vm in front of our prompt. And that means that we are currently in the virtual environment. Whenever we run Python, that is going to run the Python that is inside the virtual environment. So here we can do pip install Flask. And that is going to go and install Flask from the internet into this virtual environment specifically. So this folder here. Okay, now that we've got that, we can go ahead and make a couple of small changes to our project. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder at the very top level called templates. And I'm going to move all my HTML files into that. That's just because that is what Flask expects. Then in the outer level, we're going to create app.py, which is going to be our Flask application. In order to verify that Flask is indeed working, what you have to do is say from Flask import Flask, and then do app equal Flask dunder name. And then we're going to do app.root, and here we're going to put a /home and return hello world. So we've created a Flask app. A Flask app works by having endpoints. An endpoint is a part of an address that a user can access. So for example, this might be example.com. And if we have another route that is, for example, like this, then that would be there, example.com/rest. I'm sure if you've ever used the internet, you are familiar with this notation for accessing different pages, and this is what they're called. They're called endpoints, and this is how we define them using Flask. So we need to be aware of a couple of things, but first of all, let's see if this works. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then we're going to run Flask. So we'll do Flask run. As long as you've called your file app.py, this should work. Now we can go to a new tab here and press 127.0.0.1:5000. That's where the server is running. You can see it down there, and that should serve hello world. Since we've got that, we can now create our other endpoints for the other files. So we're gonna have an endpoint for rest and an endpoint for exercise, as well as the main endpoint here. The rest endpoint we're going to call the rest function, and here we're going to call exercise function, but they're not going to return hello world. They're going to return the HTML files. So we're going to do return render template of home.html and render template of rest and render template of exercise. So we'll do this. Flask will automatically look for these HTML files in the templates folder, which is why it's important that it's called templates. And the render template function does more than just allow you to send a file, an HTML file, to the user. We're going to learn more about exactly what it does very soon. So by doing this, we can now close the app with Control-C and then run it again, and we can refresh the page and you see that we get our HTML. So now what we've done is we've established a link between our HTML pages and our Python app. And the next step is to be able to get this form data sent to our Python app. Before we do that though, it would be nice to verify that our redirection between these pages works. So I'm going to go over to rest.html, and here, when we go to the timer counter less than or equal to 1, we're going to add a small thing. So we're going to do window.location.href is going to be equal to /exercise. And in exercise, we're going to essentially do the same thing, but we're going to go to /rest. So now that we've got that, we can go ahead, make sure our Flask app is running. We can go over to /rest and see what happens when we reach the end of the 15 seconds. You can see that the user was redirected to the exercise page, which is exactly what we wanted. Let's go back to 127.0.0.1, just the home page there, and let's start working on our form submission. Something to note is that in home.html, we already coded our form, and the forms method is post. So whenever we submit this form, we're going to do a post request. A post request is just a way of sending data from one place to another, and here we're sending the data from the form to the Python app. But however, our Python endpoint that is accepting this data doesn't actually accept the data at the moment. So if we press start, you're going to see that we get an error. So let's go back, and here in app.route, we're going to do methods equal, and then in a list, we're going to put get and post. That is going to allow this endpoint to receive not only get requests, which are the default, but also post requests. And now when the request method is equal to post, then that means that we are receiving the form data. We have to import request from Flask up here as well. We know that we're receiving form data if the request method is post, because that's really the only thing it could be. The only way that the website interacts with our Flask application through a post request is by sending the form. All other requests that we're doing, such as accessing specific pages, are always get requests. So now that we've got this, we can do something like exercise is equal to int of request.form exercise, like that. And that is going to access the form data that is included in the incoming request, the request that sends the form data. And it's going to access the exercise field inside the form. We're going to turn that into an integer, and we're going to place that into our variable. We know that we're accessing an exercise field in the form because if we go to home.html, you can see that we've got a field here with name equal exercise. So now we're going to do the same thing, but for rest and sets, since those are our other fields. We've got rest and sets. With that, we can go ahead and print them out and see what happens. So we do rest and print sets. All right, so let me close the app and run it again. And then we will refresh the page here and press start. Now we get internal server error because, of course, I didn't name my variables correctly. So we need to do that. Now we'll try again. And now we get essentially nothing changing, right? But down here we have printed out 45, 15, and 6, which are the values that we entered. Anytime a browser sends the Flask app a request, no matter what request, be that GET or POST or anything, Flask responds with whatever Flask is programmed to respond as per the endpoints defined in the application. But Flask also sends back a cookie. A cookie contains some data, and that data is stored in the client's browser. Then whenever the browser makes another request to our Flask application, it always sends us that same cookie. So due to the way Flask is coded, whenever we get a request from a browser, it is able to decode that cookie and give us the values stored inside it. So what values are stored inside the cookie? Well, that's really up to us. We can use the Flask session variable to put data into that cookie and then receive it back every time that the browser makes a request. This mechanism allows us to essentially store data in the user's browser and receive it every time they make a request, which means that we can store data per user. So we're going to use this mechanism to store the fields that they entered in their form, and then every time that they make another request back to our page, we'll be able to see the data they originally entered and use it for our progress bars and timers. So let's take a look at how we can do that. The first thing is to go ahead and import the session variable from Flask. Then instead of printing stuff out in here, we're going to do session exercise, and that's like a dictionary, equal exercise. And we're going to do the same thing for rest, sets, and also I'm going to start off a set counter that I'm going to initialize to 0. This is going to keep track of how many exercises the user has already completed. So again, this session data, exercise, rest, sets, and set counter, are going to be stored inside a cookie in the user's browser. Every time they send us a request, for example, whenever they access the rest page or whenever they access the exercise page, we're going to be able to see this data unique to each browser that makes a request. In order to create the cookies, though, we also need to set the app secret key, and this should be a long and unknown and random string that is used to cryptographically sign the cookies. So I'm not going to go into detail as to what that is, but essentially it ensures that the user cannot modify the contents of the cookies. However, the user can still see the contents of the cookies, so it's not safe to store secret data in there, but it's safe to assume that the data has not changed between requests. So now that we've got this data coming back from us and we're saving it, we want to send the users away from the home page and into the rest page. So what we're going to do is we're going to import redirect and the URL for from Flask, and down here we're going to do return redirect URL for of rest. URL for constructs a URL for a function. So here we're taking the rest function and not the REST endpoint. Flask is constructing the endpoint parting from the function name. Redirect then sends the browser a piece of information that says, hey, you want to go to /rest in this case. So this is what that's going to do. So now I'm going to save all of this. I'm going to restart my app just to verify that this is all working. I'm going to press start, and you can see that we go immediately into the REST page. However, note that if I increase the REST to, let's say, 20 seconds, this does not change. So that's our next step. We've got rest.html, and you can see that in here we've got some hard-coded values for the progress bar and the initial timer. So we want to make these dynamic based on the data that we've got from the user earlier on. What we can do is we can make use of render template. Render template actually doesn't refer to rendering HTML. It is the browser that renders HTML code. You send it HTML code and the browser will understand it and display the text and the borders and colors and so forth. So Flask is not rendering HTML. What Flask is going to do is it's going to render some other code that allows us to modify the HTML dynamically. So if we go over to rest.html, when we are serving this page with Flask, we can include in the HTML code something called the Jinja2 code. And that code is going to run in our Flask app before it is sent to the user. So here, instead of 15, we can put inside curly braces a variable that is coming from Flask. So here I'm going to put rest. Now this rest variable doesn't exist, so we have to go back to app.py and pass it in. When we render this template, we can do rest equal session rest. So this is going to grab the value from the session that is coming in from the browser and is going to pass an argument to render template called rest. Inside the file rest.html, we then have access to the rest variable that we can place in there. And we can also use it inside max and value of the progress bar. All right, let me restart the app and we'll try this again. Now you can see that we are at 20 seconds rest. We're going to do the same thing with exercise.html. So we'll go over to exercise.html and put that in there. Only I'm going to call it exercise now instead of rest, of course. And now both the rest and exercise.html files will work. However, we still haven't quite managed to redirect the user to a completed exercise page when they reach their desired number of sets. So for example, if they enter 6 sets, we want the set counter to increase by 1 every time they perform an exercise. And when they reach 6, we want to send them to another page that congratulates them on finishing their workout. So what we're going to do is we're going to do if session set counter is equal to session sets, then we're going to return a redirect of URL4 of the completed page. That doesn't exist at the moment, but I'm going to create it in a moment. So this will run instead of this, if the set counter is equal to the sets that they decided. Of course, set counter is always 0 at the moment, so we do have to increase that. So we'll do session set counter plus equal 1, and that is going to increase the set counter there. Before we move on to the completed page, which is really the end of our application, we can also go into rest and exercise.html and make this URL here dynamic. Notice that earlier on I recommended that you use URL4 instead of simply hardcoding /rest. The reason for using URL4 here instead of simply hardcoding /rest is that with URL4 you are referring to a function name. Whereas without URL4, you're referring to the /rest, and potentially these endpoints can get really long. By referring to function names that you're also less likely to change as often, then that gives your app a bit more resilience, and it makes sure that all your parts of your code are referring to the same endpoint when you're talking about a specific function. So now in rest.html, we can also make use of URL4. All we have to do here is say URL4 exercise. Make sure to use the function that is here, so this function name there. In exercise.html, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to refer to URL4 of rest. Couple important things in here, make sure you use single quotation marks inside because you've got double quotation marks on the outside, so this is still JavaScript code, and we're running this and it's evaluating to a string that we're going to simply place in there before running the JavaScript code, which is ran by the user's browser. Now that we've got all of that, we can go ahead and create our completed page. So all we have to do is app.route complete, for example, and the function must be called completed to match the URL4 string that we're using here. What this is going to do is return render template of complete.html, and the sets completed is going to be session set underscore counter. Now, of course, this file doesn't exist, so we're going to right-click that, create complete.html, and we're going to put in here our HTML code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy rest.html, paste it in here. We're going to get rid of this script there, and we're basically going to get rid of everything in here. And instead, we're going to put our heading together with some text saying that you've completed X number of sets. So I'm going to save that. And we haven't created the uCenter text property there. So let's go over to our CSS file and create that. I'm just going to put it in here. And this is going to be a display of block, text align, center, just to center the text in there. Now with this done, that reminds me of one final thing that we need to do. And that is that in every file, we've got this hard-coded text there for styles.css. We're going to use URL4 here as well. So we'll do href equal URL4 static and then file name equal css/styles.css. Just like that. And we're going to do this in every page. That is simply going to be a bit more resilient. It's going to take care of finding the CSS file there, even if we decide to change the URL structure of our page later on. There's a lot of stuff that we could add to this app, from making sounds when you're reaching the end of a rest or exercise. That would be pretty nice, so users know where they are at any point when they're finishing. It would also be nice to be able to add groups of exercises with a longer rest in between. There's loads of different things that we could add to this app, but I'm gonna leave it to you to add those features in if you want. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. Remember that all our links, including the source codes, are linked in the description of this video. Please follow the channel and subscribe, click the bell if you want to get notifications for new videos that we upload, and check us out on Twitter and Instagram as well. Everything's linked down below. Thank you so much for watching this video, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.